Welcome to This Week in Money. I'm Jim Goddard. Today, according to Martin Armstrong of Armstrong Economics, the Canadian government's anti-terrorism bill is more about your money than your security. The International Forecaster Weekly's James Corbett believes China may take desperate measures to protect its lagging economy. We'll talk to Martin Armstrong right after this.
More and more people are looking to the internet for intelligent, riveting, and thought-provoking interviews. To advertise on the Goddard Report and TalkDigitalNetwork.com, call 604-699-8600, 604-699-8600. Welcome to This Week in Money, the source for market opinions. Here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is Martin Armstrong of ArmstrongEconomics.com. Welcome to This Week in Money, Martin.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
First thing I want to talk about is you get to be a movie star. The movie, The Forecaster, can you tell us about the movie a bit?
Well, it seems to be going kind of ballistic everywhere, outside the United States. I mean, I think it's well timed. They followed me around for 3 years to do this, and I went with them largely because they were European and not American, because I didn't really feel that an American would be able to do it. Somebody would pick up the phone and say, we want a favor, and kill it. That's it. People don't realize, but I mean, I actually speak to a lot of people on Capitol Hill, and for 2 years before Snowden even anybody even heard of his name, they would say to me, carte blanche, right on the phone, not in some secret, dark hallway. Be careful what you say to us, the NSA's taking everything and want your emails and stuff. I said, to you? They're taking all your stuff? And they said, yeah. So if they said that just nonchalantly on the phone to me, that meant every journalist in Washington knew. And that's why Snowden had to go to London to get it out, because honestly, if he would have showed up to the New York Times, they would say, gee, would you like a cup of coffee? And it would have stalled him until the NSA showed up to take him. So, I pretty much did the same thing. I knew the game, and the only way to possibly get something actually out is to turn to the foreign press anymore. So I did it for Europe, and so I think a lot of different TV production, TV networks funded it and stuff. So it goes on European TV, I think, around October. They're calling it like a political thriller.
When does it show up in Canada?
I'm not really sure, because I'm not really involved in marketing or anything like that. It is fully funded by them, and it's an independent film. So I was just the guy they followed around.
What would you think of the whole process of, first of all, having your life exposed like that, or because the NSA's been following people around and recording our lives anyway, it's nothing new?
Well, I looked at it from a standpoint, quite honestly, that you have two choices in life. One, you hide in a corner, in which case they can take you out and just say you had a heart attack, or you stay out in the open. That's it. So I chose the latter. I think that's largely what you have to do, and it's. I don't know. I mean, on the one hand, people have to realize the government is not one entity. It's a lot of people inside government that are basically a lot of bad apples, and they're doing things for their own personal gain. When I go down to Capitol Hill, I'm actually introduced, this is a guy with a model they've been trying to suppress. So you look at him and go, well, it'd be nice if you told the other side. But Canada, it's really a war. You got three branches, and they all fight with each other.
Right. Well, in Canada, the Prime Minister is trying to bring in a law called Bill C-51, which is an omnibus bill that basically strips Canadians of their charter rights so they can hold you in jail without charge for a week. They say they can use any means to extract information from you short of death and rape. And they can go into your computer without a warrant. And we're just wondering, why do they need to do this? Because they seem to be catching suspected terrorists without this. Canada can suspend the Constitution with the War Measures Act. Why do they want to suspend the Constitution?
Largely because this is all about money. let's be realistic here. You got the one guy on trial in Boston. There were two kids with cell phones. All right, they're gathering every phone call, not just in the United States, the world. All right, they have everything, and they've been caught tapping into Europe, into Asia, everywhere. So here you have two kids, not sophisticated, using cell phones. All right, when you're collecting that much data, all right, they couldn't, if they could say they're going to go bomb something, and by the time they come across it, it might be a month or two. So it's got nothing to do really with protecting the public or anything else. They could care less. This is really about us, and that's really what it is, because they are broke. And rather than looking at reform, it's, to them, we're always the problem. We haven't paid enough taxes, we're cheating, we're doing this. It's never them. It's not the fact that they couldn't run anything. I mean, they're incapable of running anything whatsoever. I mean, you would never put them in charge of a business. Come on. I mean, it would be bankrupt almost overnight. They never take responsibility ever for fiscal mismanagement. Their view, and I've worked with them for a long time over the years, and just progressively keeps getting worse and worse. Their view is we are the great unwashed, and we're a bunch of fools. And there's enough of us out here, and just go out like rabbits and propagate, so we have more money coming to us all the time. And what happens is they just spend and spend and spend. There's no budget. There's nothing that they ever think about. I mean, just look at it. I mean, every year they borrow more. They never have any intention of paying anything back. So what kind of game is this?
We'll have more with Martin Armstrong right after this.
Always consult your investment professional before making any investment decision. This Week in Money is archived online at talkdigitalnetwork.com.
Welcome back to This Week in Money. I'm Jim Goddard. We're speaking to Martin Armstrong of ArmstrongEconomics.com. What about Europe? They're trying to go cashless there. Right now, there's a €750 limit on what you can spend using cash. And I hear that they're trying to do the same thing in North America. Why are they making that move?
Largely because the view is anybody with cash, you're off the grid, and they don't know what's happening to it. At Christmas, I went and I just tried to get $3,000 in cash, out of the bank, for, gifts and whatever, buying stuff or putting, like a $100 bill in for kids or something. I was there flecking out. Why you want this? It's Christmas time, It's my money. I've already paid taxes on it. Can I have it, please? They have to report $3,000.
I thought the limit was 10 grand.
Ridiculous.
I thought the limit was 10 grand.
That is a misnomer. It's 10 grand at the border. The Patriot Act lowered it to $3,000. If you try to wire or withdraw $3,000, they have to inform the government, hey, this guy's doing something with $3 grand. It might be, who knows?
Wow.
It's just, the whole thing is insane anymore. They're deliberately trying to eliminate cash as much as possible. They want to move to electronic money. And that's it. I mean, from their view is that if they get to electronic money and outlaw all cash, then they'll be okay. Nobody will be able to cheat on taxes. They'll be able to seize your bank account instantly if you haven't paid the whole thing. It's nuts.
Is that why they don't like things like Bitcoin?
They're letting Bitcoin go right now because they're watching to see how it functions. And I feel sorry for the people that are in there because I know the way they operate. What they did in the late 70s to early 80s, everybody started using futures to basically move money from one tax year to the next. They were tax straddles. They let them go for probably 7 to 10 years. Then all of a sudden they came in, find all the brokerage houses selling them, and then they hit everybody for interest and penalties and back taxes. And so then they collect 2-3 times more. They'll do the same thing to Bitcoin. I mean, the people that think that they can just, I'm out of the system, I can, move my money, whatever, good luck. I mean, you can't even take $3,000 out of the bank. You think they're going to let you people just go ahead and circumvent the entire world? No way.
We'll have more with Martin Armstrong next on This Week in Money. Welcome back to This Week in Money. We're speaking with Martin Armstrong of ArmstrongEconomics.com. The Federal Reserve, FOMC, met this week. What did they say, and how might it affect the markets?
Well, the Fed is caught between a rock and a hard place. They want to raise short-term rates, and that's largely what they control. You have everyone internationally lobbying them, please don't do so, because you have a lot of the emerging markets that issued about $7 trillion worth of debt since 2007, denominated in dollars, because it would pay lower interest rates. So if the Fed raises interest rates, you're going to start causing more problems with sovereign debt defaults. So, but the Fed at the same time can't possibly just leave rates where they are or lower, because as the stock market goes up, if they don't raise rates, then Congress is going to be all over them. The media is going, oh, you're funding the 1% and all the rest of this stuff. So they have to raise rates over the next couple of years. They have no choice about it. And so Europe is trying to go negative, and they're just absolutely destroying their economy like Japan did.
Well, with negative interest rates, I asked what's the reasoning behind it. Well, they consider anybody putting money into a bank to make money a money hoarder, and they want you to get it out of there.
The problem is that they're wiping out the elderly, pensions, and everything else. I mean, the pension funds needed 8% just to break even. That was the ideal model. I mean, many pension funds are starting to go into insolvency at this point. A lot of them, some of them that I've spoken to are starting to buy, third world debt at high interest rates to try and, catch up. So it's really a serious problem. I mean, they told people, oh, save for your retirement and you put your money in your house. Okay, fine. The houses didn't, up and down, whatever. And now you've taken their savings and you're going negative. So what do the people get out of this? They only look at one side, and it's like, well, we have to force people to start borrowing. They're not going to borrow until they have confidence that if I borrow, I'm going to actually make something. So there's no public confidence in this, and they only look at one side of the coin. They don't look at what they're doing to everybody else.
Your weekly panic cycle on the Dow moved from March 30th to April 27th. What caused the date to change?
Nothing. Sometimes that happens largely when it comes in on a Friday, Saturday. So it depends is it going to be this week or is it going to be the next week? So sometimes the things come out actually ideally on a Saturday from a timing perspective. And so sometimes you see one week produce the highest or lowest close, and then the intraday comes the following. So sometimes when it straddles towards the end or beginning of a week like that, that will happen.
Do you have an update on the 2015.75 sovereign debt crisis and the bond market?
Well, at this stage in the game, I think that we're still looking at really a bubble more or less in the bond side. If you look at, like in Germany, the bonds are like 130-some basis points through U.S. Treasuries. And really what that is that internally within Europe, it's a bet against the euro surviving. Everybody's more or less saying, okay, fine, if I buy the German bonds and the euro goes, I get Deutschmarks. So that's really the primary mover in Europe. And so we should see on this particular cycle, it's not really a bubble in stocks. It's really a bubble in the bond markets, and interest rates at historic lows. Really, it can't be sustained. Governments are not reforming. They just borrow more and more money year after year after year, and they have no intention of paying anything back.
What do you see for the U.S. dollar over the next 3 to 6 months?
The dollar is being pushed up largely because there's just simply no other place to go. And the euro is a basket case. Japan's, with currency controls and everything. I mean, Japan's not very good. Britain is actually the worst, position as far as debt is concerned of Europe. And China has its own problems, and its currency hasn't quite made it yet for prime time. So the only place for capital to park right now is still the dollar. And people have a tendency to misread that. But a currency is opposite of a stock. All right, so typically when a currency goes higher, it is more deflationary. All right, and what happens is that usually the assets are on the opposite side of it. So it's a weaker currency, which ends up people wanting to get rid of that because that's going down. So what do? They spend and they buy more of the tangible stuff. So looking at the dollar as being forced up, it's really not necessarily an endorsement of a U.S. great economy or so. It's just that everybody else is far worse. So if you think that there's going to be sovereign debt defaults, et cetera, in Europe, Greece, et cetera, and they're talking about France, what do? You got to hedge and you got to move some money out. And so you find real estate doing very well. The high-end real estate in New York, Florida, et cetera, has been bid up by all foreign money. It's not domestic.
What do you see for oil right now? Does it look like it's reached a major bottom or a temporary bottom this week?
Oil is there is definitely a supply in oil that's going to continue. That's simply the way it is. We're in a more or less a deflationary mode there as well. So, oil doesn't look like it's going to bottom out really until at least next year, in 2016, and then after that, then we'll probably see a reversal in trend. And that trend should go up into probably about 2018.
And do you see prices going back to the $100, $120 a barrel level?
No. There's been a lot of alternative fuels that are coming into play. I mean, even in Europe, when I went to Amsterdam, the taxis were Teslas. I was quite surprised. So there's been a lot of fuel efficiency, and that has brought demand down to some degree as well. And then you turn the economy down, and then people are going to be driving less as well. So, I don't see, oil coming back to where it was. I think we are in a major shift, per se, and the big demand for oil has been pretty much in Asia.
Is there any way for oil to come back then to be a major factor in the North American economy, or we'll just have to get used to lower oil?
I think we're going to have to get used to lower oil, and oil will make somewhat of a recovery. Nothing ever goes straight down, but I don't see this as being. Oil can't really recover dramatically with a rising dollar.
Gold and silver, where do they go from here?
Nothing's changed there. We still see that is under pressure until at least into the fall. There's still also the possibility that extend into early part of 2016 before a low is found, but we still see that there's not much to prevent gold actually declining under 1,000. Still, we haven't changed our target. It should. The first level of support's in the 875 to about 930 area. After that, there is a possibility of going down to as much as to 650, but if it did, it would do it in a blink of an eye and not stay there very long. But that would be a capitulation type thing.
Well, Martin, you're not the only one predicting that could happen, though.
Well, you have to realize that if the dollar's going to be very, very strong, gold rises when people lose confidence in government. It has nothing to do with inflation. If I know a lot of people have sold that as used it as a sales pitch, I guess. But you can go to our site and look. We've published a chart on gold in terms of adjusted for inflation, using just $1,982 and 1980 highs $2,300. It never broke out to new highs. That's why it fell back down. But honestly, this should be about making money. It's not really about just, scare tactics, the end of the world, etc. I mean, we're in a very fluid situation here. And honestly, I mean, if, gold is the hedge. You need that, and people will buy gold when they're really concerned who's going to be left standing, all right, as far as governments are concerned. And to get to that level, you have to get into this sovereign debt crisis, all right? That's what's going to end up creating some sort of a support level for gold. Without that, you're not going anywhere. The rumors, they started, there's no gold in Fort Knox and all this other kind of stuff. Very nice. But prove it. Are they ever going to let anybody into Fort Knox? No. So you can talk about it all you want, and it's just fictional talk at that point. It's irrelevant.
Why has China been snapping up every piece of gold they can find for the last 4 or 5 years?
Largely because they didn't have any, and second of all, we were doing that with the Japanese. You have to understand, one way to reduce the trade surplus to help political kickback, we had the Japanese before. We're saying, okay, fine, buy gold. We'll buy it in New York and take it back. It doesn't matter what it is you buy. It's going through the ports, so therefore they just add up the amount of dollars going in and out. That's it. There's nobody actually at a dock counting the number of Toyotas. All right, so as long as they bought gold in New York, they took it back, they could resell it, and they were just shipping it off to London. All right, the Chinese are doing the same thing. But you have to realize is that, the cultural aspect is that individuals are, over there have been looking, they want to do whatever it is they could not do before. You can go to a grocery store. The best dressed women are usually Russians. Why? Because any Eastern European, they were never allowed to dress nice. So to them, they would never dress in T-shirt and jeans and sneaks.
Well, of course, I look at footage of Canada and the U.S. back in the 50s and 60s. Nobody went out in public unless they were dressed up.
Right. I mean, that's all gone now. And now the best dressed are what? They're usually Eastern European.
Capital flows are important. Is capital flowing into Canada and the U.S. or flowing out?
It goes back and forth to some degree, but it's been flowing, particularly with the euro collapsing. It's been going into the U.S., been leaving Canada into the U.S. as well. Canadians actually top the list of the largest buyers of real estate in the United States, as far as not individual ticket prices. That belongs to the Chinese. But the number of properties purchased, actually, the record is held by Canada. I guess they're all going down to Florida and buying things so they can get closer to global warming.
Well, with the winter they're having in eastern Canada in the Maritimes, where they have 6, 8, 12 feet of snow, I could see why they'd want to go south.
I'm trying to go there myself.
What percentage of people do you think for themselves?
I would say if you look at I just look at largely the presidential election polls, what percentage of the population, and you'll see that the maximum, I think, was actually Richard Nixon. He got about only 67%. You had Johnson also exceeded 60 when Kennedy was assassinated, and FDR exceeded 60 on the first election only. So you're talking about who actually selects a president. I would say you're talking about between 10 to 20% max. Those are the free-thinking people that are willing to flip back and forth. So you have probably 40% who are like Democrats. No matter what evidence you throw at them and show them, they will still vote Democrat. Likewise, you have 40, the others are Republicans. And they're just, they just believe in the propaganda, and that's it, of each party. Whatever they tell them, that's it, they believe. So, I would say it's probably maximum 20%.
And of course they tell us it's those are the people who make the difference in an election then, which side they decide to go.
Exactly. They're at least free thinkers. They're willing to judge things based upon what they see and experience. So, it's, to get a bubble or something like that, you need more something of where that 40% finally starts to shift. Without that, the people who really decide the elections are probably closer into the 10-15% area. I would say 20% max.
Is the war cycle heating up, peaking, or ending?
No, it turned up in 2014, but we've been warning that it's a double cycle. It's civil unrest and it's the war cycle. So 2014 we saw both starting to go. You see all of a sudden the Cold War begin again with Russia. You have China and Japan rattling sabers back and forth at each other. But you're seeing civil unrest everywhere. I mean, they just had a state of emergency in Frankfurt. All the protests going over the opening of the ECB. As far as war is concerned, whether we get into a war, we're probably not going to see that. If it's going to materialize, it probably would materialize in Europe. And I would put, looks cyclically, that looks to be around 2017. So I mean, sure there can be skirmishes back and forth, but people do not fight when they're fat and happy. Turn the economy down and they start losing things, then you have a problem. And the U.S. policy of trying to put sanctions and hurt the Russian people with this idea that they will suddenly rise up and overthrow Putin, it's a pipe dream, because all they'll do is they're making people more anti-American than anything, and that fuels the potential for future war.
I mean, they've done research every time they do a drone strike on some terrorist leader. Research shows that something like 60 to 80 Americans are killed somewhere else a few days later.
Look, it's, I don't think the government really cares. I don't see, there's things in the internet, I mean, documents that have now surfaced that show that, they have plotted everything. They said, okay, fine, we can kill Americans, and they blame Cuba to justify an invasion there. I just put on our web about General Patton. I mean, there's more evidence coming out all the time showing that they assassinated him because he wanted to go straight into Moscow. He says Germany's not our enemy. They're in Moscow. It's the communists. So every war we've had, they've lied about it. I did a piece on it, and even LBJ, starting in Vietnam, he says, for quote unquote, he said, for all I know, they were shooting at whales that night. There was no Tonkin Gulf attack on the United States. They make up this stuff, like the weapons of mass destruction. There's somebody who has an agenda, and they will say whatever they have to say to try and get it going.
Martin, if you had a chance to run as U.S. president, would you?
I think they would assassinate me before I even put my hand on the book. They pretty much know what I would do. I don't think, it's possible to do something like that, honestly. I mean, to put it bluntly, I'm not the type that's going to be able to kiss that much ass to get into that position. So, I mean, it would have to be a completely different type of political system, honestly. I mean, I could see myself going through that process. I've worked with politicians enough. I know what it is, what it takes, and I'm not interested.
And I guess if we want to find out more about what you think, we should try to catch that movie, The Forecaster.
Yeah, because it's something that they certainly don't want you to see. And I think maybe that's why it's been taking off everywhere. But honestly, it goes into all the real political intrigues. I mean, they were trying to take over Russia. I mean, it's just very, very, it's unbelievable. But people think that you have rights. You have zero rights in this country. Zero. And it's Socrates who basically believed in democracy. He had an argument with Thrasymachus, who was recorded by Plato. And Socrates said, "Oh no, the people will, justice will always prevail in democracy." And Thrasymachus said, "No, you're wrong." He says, "Because all government is the same. It doesn't matter what you call it, if it's aristocrat, authoritarian, whatever." He says, governments only act in their own self-interest, and he's absolutely correct. It's a sad statement, but it's true.
And Martin, maybe let people know how they can subscribe to your newsletter.
Well, you can go online. You can see our site. It's armstrongeconomics.com.
Martin, thanks for being on This Week in Money.
This Week in Money is archived online at talkdigitalnetwork.com.
My guest is James Corbett, editor and publisher of the CorbettReport.com and the International Forecaster Weekly. He's speaking to us from Japan. Whereabouts in Japan, James?
It's on the western side of the main island of Japan, about halfway between Osaka and Hiroshima.
And a beautiful place, no doubt.
It certainly is. It's known as sunny country, so it's the sunniest place in Japan, but not today. It's rainy and drizzly today.
Oh, well, you'll know you'll get lots of sun later on this year.
Exactly.
We're kicking off the show talking about China. Is China in deflation right now?
Well, that's a good question. I guess it depends what metric you're consulting, but certainly as of earlier this year, we'd had 34 months and counting of negative PPI inflation in China. So absolutely producer price index inflation is in the negative territory at this point, meaning that the country is certainly on the verge of a deflationary cycle, and that should be pretty disturbing for a lot of people who have grown, we're used to the idea of an ever-inflating Chinese economy, because obviously this has been one of the main drivers of global growth in the last several years. Of course, that growth has been largely fictitious, based mostly on credit that's being created in the Chinese shadow banking system. So when that gravy train comes to an end, I think there's going to be a lot of wheels coming to a screeching halt on the tracks of the global economy.
The last announcement I heard from the Chinese government is, oh yes, we're still growing, but now at only 7%. Is that overly optimistic?
I don't even know if there's a way to calculate if that's even in the ballpark, because one thing that we do know for certain from leaked documents from inside China itself, I believe the current vice premier of China was caught in a leak a few years ago, saying that GDP data from China is unreliable and that he doesn't use it himself. He actually constructs his economic picture of what's happening in China from various other types of information, such as shipping information, how much actually is being shipped from here to there, or those types of data figures. And if you compile it, you can get an idea. But, I mean, it's just one example of that. If you take all of the different regions of China that report their own individual GDP, and you add it all up together, it doesn't add up to what is supposedly the national GDP figures. So, I mean, it is just basically made up data. So when they say 7% or 7.5% or 8% or whatever they're saying, it is a made up number that we shouldn't take too seriously. I think the only question is whether the Chinese juggernaut is slowing down or getting faster or staying the same. And all signs show that Chinese manufacturing has slumped in recent years.
What about the Chinese real estate sector? They've built all those cities with nobody in them. Is that finally catching up to them?
Well, I think this has always been the plan, because the plan has always, I think, been to increase China's export-based economy as a way of building up a certain class that would then be able to take over that slack through domestic demand. And this is the point where I think the rubber meets the road, whether or not Chinese domestic demand is going to rise to meet that level of output that the Chinese economy has become used to. And that's really, I mean, the huge question for China and for the global economy in many ways, because again, if the wheels fall off the Chinese juggernaut, a lot of people are going to be hurt by that. So there are some huge moves being made by China right now to try, I think, I don't know if the word desperately applies here, but it certainly seems like a desperate move right now to take all of the accrued trade surplus and foreign reserves that they have sitting in their bank account and use that for something productive on the geopolitical scale. So we're seeing a lot of different initiatives right now that are coming together in such things as the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which has just been capitalized with $50 billion and now has 26 7 members, including the UK, Germany, France, and I believe Italy just signed on to it. It's basically seen as a rival institution to the World Bank and the IMF and the Asian Development Bank, and it's one that, interestingly, Washington is very concerned about. They're not happy with this. They're not signed on. They don't think that this should be taking over the role of the World Bank, but the UK and others have just signed on to it in kind of defiance of Washington. So another sign, and there have been many along the way in recent years, that China is trying to flex some of its political muscle as, I think, again, an attempt to cash in on the years and years of economic growth that it's had. Now it's trying to basically flex a bit of geopolitical might. And if it can convert that, then I think that's another sign that the Chinese economy is getting less about the sort of manufacturing sector and more about turning it into an actual functioning economic and political system. Although, again, there's, I think, a long way to go between here and there.
Over the past decade, people from China have bought a lot of real estate overseas. How's the situation at home going to affect that?
Well, it really depends on whether people in China see China as a viable place for investment, because, again, as you say, the phenomenon of a lot of this Chinese money that's being made in some of these capital ventures that is filtering down to more and more of the populace, they're looking for ways to basically ensure and invest that, but people are very uncertain about the Chinese markets, where there's a lot of products that are offered to the Chinese population that in the shadow banking sector that offer 10 or 15% returns, but are very, very uncertain and rely on basically turning over these types of ongoing investments and basically making sure that people sign on to them again in a few months' time in order to basically pay off everyone who invested before. And this has resulted in a couple of near collapses in recent years. And I think people understand that the Chinese markets are still just not developed enough to handle the type of capital investment and the money that's sloshing around in China right now. So people have been looking for safe investments like real estate in the U.S. or Canada or elsewhere, and have been plowing money into that in recent years. So I think the Chinese government's objective would be to make sure that China itself is seen as an investment, that people actually trade and invest in yuan, which is, again, being gradually woven into the fabric of the global system, not only with all the trading houses that have sprung up in recent years in the UK and Australia and North America, South America, elsewhere, where people can now directly trade and invest in yuan, but also now with such things as the CIPS, which is a rival to the SWIFT system that will be online as early as the end of this year. And for those who don't know, the SWIFT system, the SWIFT network, is basically a payment order system, a processing system that thousands, tens of thousands of financial institutions around the world are signed on to, by which they send money around through the banking system internationally. But there's been a lot of talk in recent years about how America can delist Russia if they want to as part of their sanctions or that type of thing through the SWIFT network, basically taking countries offline, off of the grid, as they did with Iran back in 2012. So China has just created its own alternative system through which banks will be able to send yuan around through the international banking system directly and absolutely as instantaneously as the SWIFT network. Again, there's thousands of different data points like this that point to the fact that China is really trying to make the yuan a convertible and international currency at this point. And I think that's part of its admitted foreign policy goals, which included the Bank of China governor back in 2009 lobbying for the yuan to be included in the IMF's special drawing rights basket as part of the basket of currencies that make up this global foreign exchange type currency that's used that's facilitated through the IMF. That didn't happen in 2010 when the IMF was reviewing its SDR basket, but there's another review coming up later this year, and the Chinese yuan is a much more global, much more internationalized, much more convertible currency now. So there is a chance that China will be in that IMF special drawing rights basket, and that really is a sign that we are moving away from a U.S. dollar as the world reserve currency and towards something like an SDR basket as a world reserve currency. Not that that's going to happen overnight or in the next couple of years, but over the long term, that's where things are definitely trending. So some tectonic shifts taking place right now, and China is very much is trying to steer the ship of the global economy at this point.
For people in China who want to have more than one child, one of the rules is they have to make a major real estate investment overseas. How is that working out?
Well, as we've seen, it has led to a lot of direct investment overseas. I mean, some of the most spectacular, of course, was the purchase of Chase Manhattan's main Manhattan property for $750 million a year ago. But of course, there are thousands, tens of thousands of much smaller examples of that type of investment, and that, of course, has led to the unthinkable situation of having actually rising mortgage property values in the United States, in Western Canada, in other places where we thought the bubble had popped several years ago, but there is in fact another bubble forming in a lot of different real estate markets, especially there in the Western United States, where obviously they're greatly affected by Chinese investment. So again, it certainly has had a demonstrable effect on various places, but again, it's a question of whether that can unwind in an orderly fashion, or whether that the removal of that type of investment will be basically pulling the rug out from the property markets in the U.S. and Canada.
Australia has imposed a tax on these empty homes bought by Chinese super investors. Has that had an impact?
Not that I've seen yet, but I think the data is still out on that one. But it certainly could have some sort of effect, and will be, I'm sure, part of a regulatory framework that will be going into place in a lot of different countries in the near future, as again, this question of Chinese investment and whether it's stable and sustainable in a lot of these markets becomes more and more of a political issue. I think there will be more political incentive to create rules like that, and maybe just the Australian one by itself isn't going to fundamentally upset the markets, but I think as that starts to be implemented in many different polities around the world, I think it will start to have an effect on Chinese investment.
As the yuan increases in popularity around the world, what's that going to do to the U.S. dollar, which still continues to climb tremendously in comparison to other currencies?
That's right, yes. And it is important to keep in mind that currencies, of course, are always measured against each other. So just because the U.S. dollar index is quite strong, it doesn't mean the U.S. dollar is fundamentally more sound than it was a year or two ago. It just means that compared to something like the euro, which we know is on the brink of utter disaster, or the yen, which is being deliberately inflated away to nothing, or other similar currencies, the dollar is doing better. So it's not necessarily a sign of the strength of the dollar per se, just the strength compared to some other currencies that are doing quite poorly. And keeping that in mind, I think we can see, I mean, there is a demonstrable erosion of the U.S. dollar as the indisputable world reserve currency, as the number one trade currency. It still, of course, is far and away the most used and most traded currency in the world, but it is being slowly chipped away at by various other currencies, including, of course, the Chinese yuan, which has just, I think, last year become the second most used currency in trade settlement. So again, it's a slow process, and at this point still, far and away, the U.S. dollar is the most used currency in the world and will remain so for the foreseeable future, the near future, as the U.S. markets are large enough and the amount of dollars in the world is large enough, and the U.S., of course, military might that backs up the petrodollar is strong enough that there's no immediate threat to that. But as we say, it's a process of erosion. It's death of 1,000 paper cuts, as I like to say. So it's going to take years, if not decades, but the ultimate trend is for the U.S. dollar to eventually be replaced. Again, I don't think it will be replaced by a single currency so much as some sort of basket like the IMF special drawing rights basket, which is interesting because it's not really even a currency per se. Of course, we can't use it, to buy a stick of gum at the local store. It's only a currency that is used and held by central banks as foreign reserves, and it is convertible into any number of currencies. Well, not any number, specifically 4 currencies: the yen, the euro, the UK, the British pound, and the dollar. And again, it's a question of whether or not China will be included in that basket, or perhaps even other currencies at some point, and whether that type of model of some sort of multilateral economic framework will be adopted. And I think that that is absolutely where things are trending right now. It's really, in my mind, only a question of when and how that transition takes place.
And I wonder what we'll call that combined currency, the world currency credit, or something like that.
There have been a number of proposals. We've heard of such things as WOKU for world currency and things of that nature that people can look into, or Bancor, or again, there's been a lot of different proposals over the years, but I think the SDR system, the framework that they have in place, is probably already what they're trying to angle for. A lot of people in the global economy right now are looking towards something like that. And it's not something I personally advocate. I'm just saying that this is where the trends are going. And I think it seems pretty inevitable at this point that the political and economic momentum is behind the creation of such a system that doesn't rely on, I suppose, a single nation with a single currency to be the basis of economic growth in the world. As I'm sure many people have noticed, that tends to create a world superpower, which has its own stabilizing or destabilizing effects depending on what side of the political fence you fall on.
If we do see a delinking of the yuan to the U.S. dollar, what do you think will happen?
Well, I think it really does depend on what way China tries to shore up the yuan. And there has been speculation floated in some circles that the incredible amount of gold reserves that China has been adding in recent years is a sign that they are thinking of trying to gold back the yuan. I am quite skeptical about that. Certainly China is furiously buying and importing gold, and is constantly vying with India for the title of world's largest gold importer, and certainly does own a lot of the world's gold production at this point. They own mines all throughout the world and are heavily invested in that. So there is a fever for gold that's taken off in China in recent years. I don't think that that's going to be ultimately a yuan backing, but there are people who make that claim. Having said that, again, I think the real question for China, and whether or not it can capitalize on this economic growth that it's had over the past couple of decades, is whether or not it will be able to convert all of this economic might that has been based on an export economy into a domestic economy, and also into geopolitical capital. And again, I think they're trying quite concertedly to achieve both of those goals right now, and it's really just a question of whether or not they will A, be able to achieve it, and B, be allowed to achieve it. Because of course, if there is anything that the 20th century has taught us, it is that rising economic powers do not get along quite very well with established economic powers. So we saw, of course, the rise of Germany at the end of the 19th and early 20th, the beginning of the early 20th century, and we saw the way the British reacted to that, and of course, we know where that ended up. Unfortunately, we are in a very similar situation right now with the established U.S. superpower and the rising Chinese economic juggernaut. And I think, unfortunately, we know where that type of narrative can go, and especially if a world superpower feels threatened economically, geopolitically, militarily, we know what ways that this can go. And again, at this point, China is still, when you really look at the numbers, still a dwarf on the world stage compared to the American economy, compared to the American military, compared to American political infrastructure. But it is growing, and I think it is seen increasingly as a threat, quite explicitly so in the 2009 unveiling of the U.S. foreign policy of the Asia-Pacific pivot, where the State Department, Hillary Clinton at that time, the State Department official, saying that they were going to start turning more attention towards the Asia-Pacific region, and of course the Pentagon having become involved more heavily in terms of naval investments and other commitments of forces to this region, which I think is a trend that's only going to continue from here. So it's a very dangerous time for the world, I think, in a lot of different ways, because we are seeing this transition happening.
I just wonder if the signal that China is serious about expanding itself my question is, do they have any aircraft carriers, and do they plan to make any aircraft carriers? Because as the U.S. has found out, you want to influence anything in the world, park a couple of aircraft carriers off their coast and see what happens.
Yes, absolutely. And the question of naval might has been one that has been forefront for the Chinese PLA, the People's Liberation Army, for a number of years now. And in fact, China does have, I believe, one aircraft carrier, perhaps two. There might have been two that have come online in recent years. One of them was, I believe, leased from basically an ex-Soviet craft. But I believe they are developing or have developed their own aircraft carrier as well. So it is certainly happening at this point. And again, when you actually compare naval forces of the Chinese PLA versus the American military, there is no comparison. I mean, the U.S. would be able to handily win a naval engagement at this point, but China is absolutely developing, not only with aircraft carriers, but the so-called aircraft killer missiles that they've developed in recent years, drone technology now, which rivals a lot of what's coming online in the West. A lot of other signs that China is really stepping up its game militarily and investing quite a bit more in its military than it has in the past. So there is, I think, an attempt to create something that could militarily at least rival something like the United States. But again, we're still quite a far way off from that in every aspect except for sheer personnel, sheer number of troops that China can commit. Obviously, the largest army in the world, and just this sheer number of people that would be available to fight is pretty overwhelming.
Taking a look at the price of oil, who have been the winners and losers so far with the big drop in oil, and we still don't know where this is going to end up yet.
Well, I just wrote an article for the International Forecaster about how, surprisingly, some of the big oil giants who you would think would be hurt by the falling prices are, of course, being hurt, but not as much as you would think, because specifically when you look at the European oil giants, BP, Shell, and Total, you see that they have actually huge trading operations that most people don't know about. So they trade oil as a commodity. They don't just drill it. They don't just refine it. They don't just sell it that way. They also trade as a commodity. So they trade in the futures markets. And as a result, for example, if you look at the 2009 price plunge, where prices fell exorbitantly down in January of 2009, BP actually made $500 million from its trading desk, an extra $500 million, I should say, from its trading desk during that plunge, because, of course, they were obviously trading, and they had a short position on oil at the time, so they were able to profit from it. So, interestingly enough, big oil, or at least the European big oil giants, may not be as badly affected by this as some people might think. Politically, some of the big losers, of course, are those countries which rely on oil revenue, which includes, of course, Russia and Iran and Venezuela and some other people who tend to be on the U.S. State Department hit list, as well as my own home and native Alberta, of course, which is a heavily oil-backed economy. But beyond that, of course, U.S. Shale gas revolution that's been taking place has been hurt by this. Obviously, shale oil production is much less profitable, if profitable at all, at prices this low. In fact, we've probably reached the point where it is completely unprofitable for a lot of these operations. And if this is prolonged, if this is a prolonged slump, we will see a lot of those operations going under. Interestingly enough, I think one of the big winners in all of this is China, who is, of course, not only a major oil importer, but a couple of years ago surpassed the U.S. as the world's largest oil importer, and is absolutely thirsty for the black gold, which they are now, they announced late last year they are committed to shoring up reserves because of the oil slump. They're going to be purchasing, I can't remember how many extra millions of barrels of crude a month, but they're going to be stocking up during this. So they're basically buying up oil on the cheap, and I think they're going to be one of the big winners from all of this, which is interesting considering in recent years we've seen Saudi Arabia pulling back a little bit from the United States and showing that they're not necessarily in lockstep with them, as they have been since the dawn of the petrodollar era back in the 1970s, or even through the security cooperation that goes back to the end of World War II. And we've seen Saudi Arabia starting to, I think, realize that their bread is buttered, at least in the future, with the world's largest oil importer, China. So we may see another tectonic shift taking place, just basically because of the economic momentum that's accruing towards the Chinese juggernaut. So again, if the Chinese juggernaut slows down, or if this changes, that could upset that apple cart, and we may see some of this unwinding. But for the moment, it looks like China is going to be one of the big winners on the geopolitical level from all of this.
Will the U.S.'s position on net neutrality contribute to freedom on the internet, or actually close it down?
It is absolutely the case, as with every other government regulation, that it will not certainly contribute to freedom on the internet. My position on net neutrality is that, of course, net neutrality is a good policy, and we should support any internet service provider that promises it. And for people who don't know, net neutrality is the principle that on a network, all data is treated equally. There's not a fast lane for certain people who pay more. There's not a slow lane for people who the ISPs don't like. All data gets traded around the internet equally, which is good, of course. Obviously, as someone with an independent website myself, I appreciate that, because it means that people can access me in the exact same way and at the exact same speeds that they can access a Disney or whatever. Of course, big corporations can pay for better bandwidth, but the data itself is treated equally. However, so it sounds like a great thing when the FCC comes along and says, well, we're going to ensure this is going to happen so that the ISPs can't create a fast lane or a slow lane for data or do any of those types of manipulations. However, unfortunately, with the way that this has been worded, these new regulations, it gives an exorbitant amount of power for the FCC, whether or not this particular bunch of chairmen of the FCC or a future bunch, to basically dictate a lot of the internet market in the United States and how it is run. Not only in terms of the rates that ISPs charge, which they can actually regulate under the types of regulations that they've imposed. They say they're not going to, but I'm sure we can trust them as far as we can throw them on that point. But not only in terms of regulating rates, but in terms of allowing the types of regulations that we've seen in talk radio in the United States in the past, with the fairness doctrine and things like that, where basically people's First Amendment rights can be limited because now the FCC can say, well, as our power to regulate the internet allows us, we will now regulate what types of speech people can use online. It is at least a possibility that can happen. And again, I'm not saying it's necessarily going to happen now or in the near future, but at some point in the future, these types of regulations can give that type of power away. So it is interesting to note that I just found out today, and apparently a lot of people are just finding out, that an investigation has been opened by the FCC watchdog, the Inspector General Office, into these new internet rules. And we don't really have any details whatsoever about this investigation yet, but there is going to be some sort of hearing on this. There is an investigation underway. So some of these rules may actually be reversed yet.
James, again, maybe remind people where they can find your newsletter.
Well, this one-stop shop for all of my work is CorbettReport.com. That's CORBETT report.com, where I have hundreds and thousands of hours of audio and video media available for free download. I also do a weekly subscriber newsletter, and I write for the International Forecaster, which is available at theinternationalforecaster.com.
Thanks again for chatting with us.
Thank you so much for having me on. Always a pleasure.
My guest has been James Corbett, editor and publisher of the CorbettReport.com and the International Forecaster Weekly. That wraps up the show for this week. Thanks to our guests, Martin Armstrong and James Corbett, and thank you for listening. Comments or questions for This Week in Money can be emailed to info@howstreet.com. I'm Jim Goddard. We're back next week with more This Week in Money.
This Week in Money is a production of How Street Media Incorporated.